The issue of life and when it begins has been a contentious one for years, and during that time we have seen a number of issues pop up concerning abortion and the pro-life, pro-choice debate. But with the recent passing of Ontario's Bill 122, the issue of access to information pertaining to the termination of life in the province of Ontario has both sides wondering what has happened to our right to information. The Institute of Family and Marriage's Andrea Mrozek explains.
Bill 122 came across the radar a little bit later in the game. It's something that had been discussed obviously in committee and by provincial members of Parliament for some time, long enough in order that it had been passed, and then it came to our attention through a blogger who frequently does access to information requests. And she found out through one of her access to information requests that she had been denied, and was given Bill 122 as a reason for being denied. So it's at that point that we found out about it.
Bill 122 was passed in late 2010 and came into effect January 1st, 2012. Entitled the Broader Public Sector Accountability Act, MPP Frank Klees of Newmarket and Aurora was present for the second and third readings at Queen's Park.
The act is intended to provide more transparency and accountability. Obviously, to protect privacy at the same time, but the initiative was really to ensure that there is more transparency, not only in our hospitals, but across the healthcare system and throughout government.
But what many didn't realize, including Klees, is that buried in this new legislation was an amendment to an over 20-year-old law, the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. Not until blogger Patricia Maloney made a routine access to information request earlier this year, exercising a right all Canadians have to request information from the government.
Freedom of information is a standard tool of journalists, but it's also something that's open to the general public, and I'm thinking people don't know that. So journalists will use it to all the stories you hear about politicians overspending and $8 glasses of orange juice. That type of story tends to be found out through an access to information request. And all that means is you filled out a special form, you sent it to your government, you asked for them to search for certain terms and to reveal information that they would not choose otherwise to reveal.
Maloney happened to be requesting information on recent abortion statistics when, according to her blog, she got this response. Ontario's Freedom of Information Act, which went into effect on January 1st, 1988, states that the purposes of this act are to provide a right of access to information under the control of institutions in accordance with the principles that information should be available to the public, necessary exemptions from the right of access should be limited and specific, and decisions on the disclosure of government information should be reviewed independently of government, and to protect the privacy of individuals with respect to personal information about themselves held by institutions and to provide individuals with a right of access to that information. Under Bill 122, the amendment to the Freedom of Information Act under Section 5.7 states, the Act does not apply to records relating to the provision of abortion services. Klees admits not catching the amendment buried in the bill when it was up for debate 2 years ago.
I, of course, was involved in the debate on that bill. I was involved in second reading debate as well as third reading debate. I was not present for the vote. I was out of the country. But that particular aspect of the amendment is something that passed me by. There were other issues that we were focused on. And so the fact that it wasn't something that I personally, and I've spoken with a number of my colleagues who likewise are surprised that it was there. And that's what happens often when we unfortunately get an omnibus bill, a bill that is fairly substantive, with many other issues that are the focus. And sometimes these small lines are tucked into the bill, and here we are after the fact asking why it's there.
Yeah.
According to the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada's Faye Sonier, this amendment comes as they have already seen a slow decline to access on abortion information over the past couple of years.
Abortion stats were first collected or began to be collected in 1969 when there was the initial amendment to the criminal code dealing with the section on abortion, and then so they were collected then by Statistics Canada, and then following the Morgentaler decision that struck down that provision in the criminal code in 1988, it also struck down the provision that required the collection of abortion statistics. So it went downhill from there. Since then, Statistics Canada, which is a government body, transferred the responsibility for collecting and reporting data over to CIHI, which is the Canadian Institute for Health Information, and they've been doing the best they can to collect, but because there are such a mixture of reporting requirements in Ontario, it's really a mixed bag. So, for example, in Ontario, private clinics don't have to report. Hospitals have to report because they have to report all activity to the Ministry of Health. Abortions that are paid for out of pocket in clinics aren't reported at all because they're not covered by OHIP. So it's really, really problematic, and it's difficult for both decision makers and Ontarians to make decisions or take a position or decide if their tax dollars are used well when we don't have the data in front of us to make that decision.
But greater than that, Sonier adds that limiting the public's access to information brings up a broader issue.
If we want to evaluate, the province wants to evaluate its safe sex programs in schools. How do we do that if we don't know the abortion rates? If we want to determine teen pregnancies, that number is determined by combining the number of live births with miscarriages with abortions. So if you strike out or render the abortion data incomplete, there's no way again to make that evaluation. So, like I mentioned before, this is tough for decision makers, for policy makers in the provincial government, but it's difficult for us to take a stand and determine if we like what the government is doing or not. It goes to the very core of what is transparency and accountability in government.
Member of Provincial Parliament Klees agrees.
And I think we all should know what is happening in our hospitals, whether it's knee operations or whether it's hip replacements or whether it's abortions. I think that the taxpayer is footing the bill. We, I believe, have the right to know. There should be transparency and accountability.
But this is far from being solely an Ontario issue, says Sonier.
Well, in 2001, British Columbia enacted legislation somewhat similar to ours, but it's nowhere near as broad. It said that specific data, if I'm getting this correctly, specific data couldn't be released, but at the end of each year they could release general statistics about the numbers, for example, across the province. So it's nowhere near as severe as the legislation we're currently dealing with in Ontario. But those are really the only two, Ontario and BC are the only two provinces that are dealing with this type of legislation.
In an attempt to cover all sides of this story, we did contact the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Ontario, whose responsibility it is to protect the right of Ontarians to access information, but they declined to comment on this issue, instead referring us to the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care. We sent a request for an interview to the Office of the Ontario Health Minister, Deb Matthews, but as of air date, we have not yet heard a response to our questions. But in a statement provided to the National Post, the Ministry of Health said records relating to abortion services are highly sensitive, and that is why a decision was made to exempt these records. Klees says this should not be a contentious issue, but simply one pertaining to the rights to access information.
It's a straightforward question. What is happening in our hospitals? And if we have statistics about the number of knee operations, in fact, it's interesting, of course, the government boasts of the number of knee operations and hip operations and sees that, of course, as something laudable. Why would we withhold information on this procedure? And so, if people are interested about it, write your MPP and ask for the answer to be brought forward.
In Toronto, Ontario, Magdalene John, 100 Huntley Street.